Welcome to Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church. Sexual orientations and gender identities, and we're an open place. Here's a few announcements. It's probably a good idea to come to church on the computer or on TV, as it may be, with a pencil and some notes, because it's a good way to learn about what's going on. Couple things in no particular order. Looking up on October 15th, on Thursday, we have our book group meeting. It's a book by Isabella Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's an epic of migration of African Americans from the south to the north. So people are reading that, and they're gathering on Zoom for that call at 10 o'clock on October 15th on Thursday. Isabella Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns. We have our Zoom call today at 1 o'clock, as we always do, focused on race issues. This week, we have groups coming back. We're going to have seekers back, and if any of the adult ed programs are scheduled, we're going to try to meet on campus. Maybe not the French discussion group, but most others. We have also we're starting a race-based conversation on social media. It's a little unclear as to whether it'll be on Zoom or Facebook, but you can look for that. Starting this Saturday, 10 to 11:30, we're going to have more elaborate conversations. I'm going to bring in some guest speakers. You're also welcome to come up on campus and sit. We're going to be outside. We're going to film it at least on Facebook Live, and we're going to try to be interactive and virtual at the same time. So we're going to socially distance folks from this. Is every Saturday from now almost to Thanksgiving. It's 7 in a row of those sessions. So thanks for that, and hopefully you can come up to that. On Saturday afternoon, 2 Saturdays from yesterday, the 10th, from 4 to 6, we're going to have a pre-election gathering. We're going to have Amanda Keating, who's a favorite of ours, going to come back. She's going to lead a political discussion as we approach ever closer to this very important election. We're going to have ice cream sandwiches. I'm sure we'll have some wine and sodas. We're going to have Severin and Gary and Bob Monzingo play, maybe Steve Schlegel as well. Do a little music, a little lecture, a good chance to get us up on campus safely, distanced from one another outside. That's a very live event and not a virtual one. I'd like to now invite up Leanne Hart, who's going to make an announcement about postcarding, and I'm going to read our chalice words for us. Leanne?
Good morning. I just wanted to give a really big shout out to all the people who showed up for Getting Out the Vote postcarding here at PUC. We worked with an organization called Reclaim the Vote that specialize in contacting people across the U.S. who were removed from their voting registries in their different states for one reason or another. So I started back in June, and we had 500 postcards to send. I got about 12 volunteers. And then I said, well, that's enough. That's good. But Steve said, no, let's do more. Let's do more. So with his encouragement and the big assistance from Kelly Kinsman, we held 3 more groups, concluding yesterday. So, altogether, PUC and friends filled out and mailed over 2,000 cards. That's 2,000 people reached out to. So, thank you, all the volunteers who stepped up. Some are still at home writing cards right now and to support voting rights. Okay, let's move on to our chalice lighting. Here in this place, hallowed dreams, disappointments, and joys, hallowed by the sorrows, successes, and failures of this community, and all of those who have gone before. We come together to join the holy sparks within each heart.
And now Severin's going to share with us a hymn.
What day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear, and the children will laugh without wondering whether on that day thunder clouds will appear. Wait and see what a world there will be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there will be if we share, if we care, you and me. Some have dreamed, some have died to make a bright tomorrow, and our vision remains in our hearts. Now the torch must be passed with new hope, not in sorrow, and a promise to make a new start. Wait and see what the world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there will be if we share, if we care, you and me.
I'd like to gather the kids in front of the computer. Funny to say. But if your children are there, come forward. This is the children's moment. I think this is the high holidays were last week through this week. It's a good time to explain them. They're an important part of why the Jewish and the Christian traditions, the Muslim traditions have this strong sense of repentance and forgiveness. And I grew up a Gentile or a Christian, as it may be, and it's hard to understand it because it seems a little out of place. So Rosh Hashanah is the new year, and that is a day of judgment too. Funny that it's a new year. You'd think the celebration would come later, which confuses me because sometimes I don't know the tradition all that well either. And then Yom Kippur comes up, which is the big day. Here's the simplest way to understand it. The way it's built is that as if the last day of classes, if you're thinking about judgment and you're going to get a grade, was Rosh Hashanah, right? So that's the last day. But the way the Jewish people think of it, God is so merciful. There's this 10-day period where you get to cram in all of your forgiveness before the final grades are given in the book. So you've got like this grace period in a Christian sense. You have this period of, pulling victory from the jaws of defeat in terms of making sure your prayers are actually forgiven before the final exam is written. That would be Yom Kippur. Here's a great little story. There was a person born as a Jewish person. He was an orphan, and he went to live with this Gentile couple, and he He didn't have any Jewish traditions. He never really learned anything. He knew that he was a Jew, and he knew that the Jews believed in God. And he was a sort of a shepherd, and he would play the flute. And he was out in the fields, and the first high holy day came by, Rosh Hashanah, and a lot of the townsfolk passed by his little field and his house, and they were going off to the temple. There was a famous rabbi, and they wanted to be near the rabbi for the high holidays. So he stopped and talked to them on the way, and they didn't, he knew he was Jewish, and they said, well, you should come to temple. But he didn't know any of the prayers. They didn't really make him feel entirely welcome. So they went to the temple, they came back, and then the next weekend, so to speak, 10 days later, they came again, and he was confused. He said, weren't the high holidays just last week? And they said they were, but they extend to one more day. This is Yom Kippur, the day of final prayers, of final reckoning. So the young boy didn't really know what to do. He went and talked to his Gentile parents, and they said, I think you should go to temple. So he went into temple, but he followed the crowd. He didn't feel uncomfortable. He didn't know them, as you wouldn't. He wasn't necessarily terribly invited by them. So he went and he sat outside the temple for a while. And he didn't know the language because, right, they were speaking Hebrew, and he didn't. So he stood outside for a while, outside of the temple, and then he came in, and he was so moved by all of his sort of kinspeople praying so fervently. There they were in the temple, and the famous rabbi was up front, and the rabbi was up there, and they were praying. But the rabbi didn't feel like the people's prayers were honest or earnest enough. The boy didn't know that. He just came in, and he didn't really have the language, but he knew how to play the flute pretty well. So he came in, and not knowing the tradition, sat down, and eventually, not knowing what to say, was moved, and he started playing the flute well. The people looked at him. That's a violation of the whole holiday. It's a very somber day, and you wouldn't be playing music in the temple. So they turned to him, and they were sort of judgmental of the boy. But the rabbi came down and said, no, that's exactly what we needed. These prayers were not making it up to heaven, right? There's a great Jewish tradition that if the prayers of the people, if the prayers of the temple don't make it into the street, that they don't make it to heaven, if they don't reach the common people. So the rabbi came down and thought that the boy's effort to reach out to God and to do the only way of communication that he knew how was to play his flute, was such an earnest and just truthful way to pray, that he came down, and the rabbi brought him back up to the front of up on the dais up at the start, and he sat there for the rest of the service, and he praised the boy for being earnest and speaking in the language that he could. So that's the story for today. So I think the theme of the prayer, which I'm going to come into after we do joys and concerns, is very much about that earnest, honest concern. So I'd like to invite Gary or Leanne to come forward and light our candle of joy or concern. I love to say this is the hard part of the service for me, because it's such a joy to watch people come up and talk about the struggles and the joys in their own lives, but we're not here. Hopefully soon enough, we'll be back. We'll see. But there are a number of joys and concerns. This last weekend, we lost Mal Verges, who's a longtime member of the church. His wife Linda in there, and I was over the house, and they had Zoroastrian prayers. He comes from Farsi tradition. Lovely man, worked in the insurance trade and was a sailor for a lot of his life. And we think of him. We think of Penny Turnell recovering, and of Chelsea, who's recovering from shoulder surgery. Penny from her hip. We think about the fires that are everywhere. I was going to hike San Gregorio or whatever it's called tomorrow, but the fires. De Benneville, which is our beloved camp, seems to be safe from the fires, and all that's good. So there's joys and concerns mixed in there. Themed on the rabbi's effort to sort of cultivate earnest prayers, I thought I would write a prayer that teaches us how to pray. So if you want to bow your head, if you want to find a somber spot, I want to teach you how to pray. not how, or maybe how I pray, and not how to pray. I'm not arrogant or faithful enough to think that I know everything about prayer by any means. And I think the first step is to stop worrying about whether you are praying correctly or you're praying for the right thing. Plenty of your religious life should be about right or wrong, good or evil. I don't think prayer has as much to do with that as it has to do with sincerity. Since no one can assure us of who or what or anything is at the end of these little poignant letters our heart writes, I trust that nobody has the real skinny on how to do this primitive act perfectly. So, stop thinking about where it might land for a minute, whether it's worth praying or not for a minute, and get up those feelings. Get up those feelings of earnest gratitude. Get those yearnings up and out of you, into your lips, out of your heart. I don't want to sound like a kindergarten teacher, but genuineness to me is the way that I evaluate my prayers. I think you have to mean a prayer. You have to feel a prayer, maybe even need a prayer. So parents may not be happy with this advice, but I think if you're not really grateful for the food in front of you, or for someone to get better, or you find yourself in the middle of a prayer that sounds like a litany of words strung together with somebody else's agenda, I encourage you to stop. Tell your parents that you don't feel like praying right now, and tell yourself you're going to save your prayers for when you really mean it. If there's a God, I'm convinced that that God is bored by the kind of prayers that people just say. If you find yourself trying to mouth the right words, for the integrity of your conscience and the integrity of any listener that may be at the end of a prayer, just stop. Prayer should never feel like spam in your email. If you want to pray that your boss is out sick today because you haven't finished the thing that's due, I say go for it. If you're praying because you need that last scratch ticket to be worth at least $1 so you can buy another scratch ticket, I say go for it. There'll be noble causes on other days to pray for. Examining if your concerns are worthy is not really what prayer is about. That's a different religious concern. And I fear that people give up the act of praying, one, because they don't trust that it's going to land anywhere, but two, because they witness themselves not being sincere. Trust me, life is dangerous enough. There'll be cancers and scary turbulence that shakes the plane, prayers of simple gratitude that will bring you to your knees on other days. Pray for what you think you need. Pray for what you want. Abraham and Sarah fame prayed to have a kid in her 90s, and it worked. If there's a source at the end of our prayers, if that letter from our hearts lands anywhere, trust. This reading is adapted from Greg Ward's sermon, Abraham and the Peach Seed Monkey, which was preached in Berkeley, California. I'll begin. The story of Abraham and Isaac is found in the 22nd chapter of Genesis.
The story starts out plainly. One day, God tested Abraham.
It begins, Abraham, the voice calls.
Here I am, he replied.
Take your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac. Go up to the mountain Moriah, build an altar there, and make a sacrifice of him there on one of the hills I will show you.
That was the whole message, the request from his God, Abraham's test.
The Bible doesn't say whether Abraham paused, whether he scratched his head, whether his mouth dropped open, or whether he asked his wife Sarah what she thought.
It only says he saddled his donkey, took Isaac and two other men, the wood he had chopped for sacrifice, a firestone and a knife.
3 days into this journey, the story tells how Abraham saw the mountain from a distance. He leaves the men behind and continued on with his son Isaac. They walked together with the wood, the firestone, and the knife.
Father, calls Isaac.
Here I am, Abraham replied.
Isaac asked, here is the stone and the wood and the knife, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?
The Bible doesn't describe as he answers the question.
It doesn't say whether he looks at Isaac as they walk or if he stares straight ahead. It doesn't say whether his answer comes with determination or with a weak voice.
The Bible doesn't say, but it seems to me this would reveal a lot about whether Abraham passed the test.
God will provide the lamb, Abraham answers.
Abraham and Isaac, they continue silently towards the mountain. The altar is built. The wood is stacked. Abraham binds his son and places him on the altar. And just as he raises the knife against his son, God intervenes and spares Isaac.
The story says Abraham looked up and noticed the ram caught in nearby thicket. The ram is sacrificed instead of Isaac, and Abraham named the place YHVH, Yera, meaning God provides.
Thank you, Sarah. Crazy story, right? Historically, this story of sacrifice has been told and been preached about. It was inserted in the Bible with the purpose and perspective that when Abraham was under the greatest distress, he proved faithful. And of course, in the end, God merciful. A no harm, no foul challenge of humans' fidelity to God. A classic Hebrew Bible test. The Bible doesn't give us any feedback, however, on the long-term impact of this loyalty experiment on either the father Abraham or his son Isaac. There are no reports from the therapists that Isaac certainly probably could have used. There's no commentary on how he was impacted, how he processed his way through that moment where his father nearly sacrificed him to appease his God. Greg Ward, from whom the reading is derived from, notes in his sermon on Abraham and fatherhood that there's an interesting phenomenon, though. Nowhere in the verses in the Bible after that faithful day are Isaac and Abraham ever reported speaking again. They're never together again until Abraham passes. This could be an oversight. It might just be skipped by the biblical tellers in the fast-paced Genesis story. But it also might be about the trauma and the bitterness that remains unsaid. Given the Bible's silence on this matter, we'll sort of never know. What is clear is that in the upcoming chapters in Genesis, when Sarah, Abraham's wife and Isaac's own mother, dies, there is no Isaac there. 2 chapters later, when Isaac marries Rebekah, his dad Abraham is not there. The next time the Bible mentions Isaac being with his father is when he comes to bury him. No tears are noted to be shed. How about Abraham? From our perspective today, it's easy enough to understand him as an abusive father. You can't hear that story and not account for the depth of feeling. Taking his long-awaited, naturally born son to the foot of a special mountain, tying him up and holding a knife over him, awaiting for God's word on to whether he should kill him. Hearing this story again, my first instinct on Abraham is not that he's the esteemed father of the monotheistic traditions that have set the religious life of the West. It's that he should be turned into the Department of Social Services, if not the cops, for his behavior. Certainly, here at Yom Kippur, what he did was worth some atoning for. Nevertheless, let's use our modern world's empathy we've been so trained at, our good you instinct to really understand matters, and consider the impact of this horrific test on him. Let's take a minute of modern sensibility the Bible would never afford humans who are supposed to be completely allegiant and be with Abraham for a second. Standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, it had to be brutal. If he has a heart at all, it had to be brutal. Should he follow what we presume and hope was in his heart and untie his son or never bring him in the first place? Or follow through on what he believes he's told to do by a God he believes is speaking to him personally, who has promised him fame, fortune, and legacy? There Abraham was, trapped in a scene too destructive and creepy to even write into a horror film script. Think about that. It would be cold, nasty. Compelled by his God to hold a knife over his own son's head, a son he's asked to cooperate with being tied up on this makeshift altar of kindling, they carried to the site. We, of course, don't know what's in Abraham's heart. He's remarkably silent during this period. We do know that that's bound to be a mess left behind. It's a brutal, rich, sick, traumatic, stressful moment that would likely leave a mark on both of them, of course. They both likely suffered from post-traumatic stress. How could they not? They both likely, as we would never know, because the purpose of the story is to evaluate how faithful Abraham was and to impress the audience who's reading it that God means serious business. On Yom Kippur, the most morally guilt-ridden time of year, let's instead throw some grace of tolerance that we're famous for at him and explore his story even more. As we judge Abraham, which we instinctively must, I think, let's remember that the voice asking him to sacrifice Isaac comes from the same God who stepped in to violate the laws of nature that were in place and give Abraham and his 90-year-old wife their very first kid, at least together. That wasn't that many years prior. We have to remember Abraham is old school, that this story takes place in a world where making the sacrifice of first fruits, be they grains, goats, or even children, was not that uncommon. Abraham lived back in a time that's originally, he was from the city of Ur, which was located in modern-day Iraq. Ur, the very name of his city, has come to mean the original or first of something. This is around the time that we're sort of settling in any size cities at all. Abraham's story takes place in Genesis, the obvious, as we all know, first book of the Torah, I hope, and we build up the story when he's compelled to leave Ur for the first promise of the promised land from God in Canaan. Abraham, of course, hears that he's going to be a leader of a great nation and have a multitude of people in his legacy. It's in this moment that we should think, that incredibly now, I believe, outdated and problematic command that we should go forth and multiply originates. Abraham is promised by God that his descendants will outnumber the stars, and that promise in hand causes him to move. There he is, of course, taking the person that has his genetic legacy with his Jewish wife on an altar. Good God. Maybe not so good God. The mountain god that was speaking to Abraham in this case was Elohim. Elohim and Yahweh end up becoming merged in a silent way in the Bible, another 500 or 600 years later. But let's think about Abraham. His time is 1900 to 2000 BCE. That's just about 4,000 years ago. We almost pick up the story of the Jewish people here, but that isn't even really true. Moses is another 500 or 600 years later. I think of Abraham as the most iconic patriarch and essentially the Jew. He's one of the characters in this blurry time when we move from myth to history. Abraham is a bit of a link between the very old world that predates most written work and a time that we begin to get a grasp on. For the sake of perspective, Abraham follows Noah after Noah and the flood, but comes before Moses in this famous escape from Egypt. For more perspective, Abraham is as far from Jesus early as we are from Jesus after. He's the first Jew in the way that Jesus is the first Christian, neither of them aware of what's to come and the identity that they're going to help create. He's also thought of as the first monotheist. This is not entirely true, but he's the start of the Western tradition of monotheism. Here's another story Abraham had to face. If you thought nearly sacrificing his son was dramatic, here's another dark tale that he's formally caught up in. It wasn't easy, and this happened all at the end of his life. Abraham's a rich man. He has an age-appropriate wife named Sarah, who they're both childless, and they're more than beginning to worry that this promise from God that they're going to have a multitude of people behind them and to follow them is not going to be. Sarah proposes that Abraham have a kid with Hagar, the maidservant, essentially a would-be Muslim slave, an Arab. He agrees, and they have the son Ishmael. The plan they conceives. In this 4,000-year-old novella, just when things seem to have worked out, though, and they have a young child in their midst, God sends 3 messengers to Sarah, who is 90, that she is pregnant with a son. Sarah, who believes she's too old to have a kid, literally laughs. Isaac's name means laughter. She thought the messengers were crazy, but she was pregnant and had Isaac. For a while, all is well and good in this hot tent in the middle of the desert. However, as you might imagine, 2 women with 2 kids from the same father in tight, cramped spaces, there's some trouble. Over time, the thoughts as to where Abraham's allegiances really are probably pop up. Who will inherit what rises up. The trouble reportedly boils over when Sarah believes the older Ishmael, who came first, was mocking his half-brother Isaac. However, Sarah, being Abraham's wife, also reportedly his half-sister, and Hagar being a slave and a foreigner in this house, makes it an unequal conflict. Sarah decides she wants Hagar and Ishmael to leave. Abraham, sensitive to both sides, stuck in the middle really, doesn't really want to kick out Hagar and his firstborn son. Unclear of what to do, he turns to God for advice. God with advice that sounds remarkably like telling Abraham, look, happy wife, happy life, man. Sides with Sarah. Soon Hagar and Ishmael, now 14 years old, are sent out wandering into the desert. It isn't exactly clear if she leaves on her own, is kicked out, but clearly trouble pushes them out the door. And out into the desert, those two flee with a famously small amount of bread and water. As the story is told, because of God's benevolence, and perhaps in part of his long-term plan for Hagar's people, God sends an angel to save them, telling them where a small amount of water can be found, and also promising to them that they will be a nation of Ishmael's descendants, a flourishing nation. This is the mythic start of what we think of as Muslims. Muhammad was sure to tell this story and link the Muslims with the Jewish tradition and with Abraham. Next time you think about the news and hear about all the tension between Jews and Christians and Muslims, remember this story. Stories back here are like a game of telephone tag, of course. They're not necessarily reliable. We have Abraham at around 1900 years. We don't have most of the Bible being written until another 1200 years. That doesn't mean they don't matter. It actually means these stories matter more. If they just happened and there was just that singular family drama in that tent in the desert, it wouldn't matter as much. Take for a minute the Bible's pattern of indifference to human experience in these morality tales. Wouldn't the Bible, if it were really speaking to us today, hear and allow for more varied stories like we're trying to be inclusive in these times, trying to get voices from different races, genders, identities, ages? What if we heard from Hagar? What if we heard about her motivations and not had the Muslim woman, slave in the tent, be silent? Wouldn't the Bible be more relevant? The Bible would be more relevant if we heard from Ishmael as well. I hate to reference it, but you know, when you're on, if you ever watch The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, which I don't much, they always draw those people back in to see what it was like to be rejected by the host. At this time of Yom Kippur, at this time of moral examination, it seems to me that the most indictable person in this story is God. Think about the progress we've made. The stories Abraham has to face, the tales he's placed in, are maniacal. Our sensitivity towards humans and the morality has generally improved. To me, the main takeaway from the story is that Abraham is a foil, not a patriarch. Ask yourself, how could God sanction the behavior of Sarah and tell Abraham to cast Hagar out? How could Sarah, the most important matriarch in the religion that basically invented atonement and forgiveness for us, that highlights the holiest of days we are in, be such a reprehensible model and unsensitive to the cost of what it was to be kicked out of that tent? How could God place ethnicity over basic human principles, values, and justice? I think we advance on Yom Kippur as much as anything when we ask these kind of questions of ourselves honestly and of our traditions. Yom Kippur is about asking those kind of hard questions to improve. We're all never asked, but live out the question of how much we want to examine ourselves. I love this holiday for that tough request. And I say, as a sort of modern humanist who is trained in scripture and, my faith, that is an insanity that a God that I believe in would never cause. God would never create such trauma just to test loyalty for zealous, jealous reasons. The Bible can be pretty hard. It can be pretty blind to the psychological impact of the experience that people face. I believe it's limited as a moral resource today for those reasons. In my worldview, the only unsympathetic character, as I said, is God. All throughout these early scriptures, without seemingly much understanding of his impact, he tests Abraham, Job, Noah, Lot, Moses, and I suppose Jesus even qualifies too. We need to call out that pattern. We need to continually embrace different voices as we look at our morality. I think the greatest message derived from this tale is that these stories are of an old way. A tale from a time blind to the impact of trauma and of a human conception of God as being more loyal and zealous and jealous and petty than loving. I think these stories show that we have morally grown and perhaps even have internalized a consciousness that wasn't there in Abraham at the time. The story teaches us how soft we've become, how humanist we've become, and I believe how much better we are for it. Amen. Farah's going to come up and share with us our offertory words.
There have been few moments in the Bible more than the moment God asked Abraham to not tie up a ram as he has expected, but to tie up and prepare to sacrifice his 12-year-old son Isaac. 12. I have a thought about this disturbing moment too. I believe that what is missing in all the talk about Abraham nearly sacrificing his son is the fact that I believe if God had waited just a couple of more years until Isaac had fully become a teenager, imagine what would it be? It might not have been considered as a sacrifice. Imagine teenagers. That's my contribution, and now it's time for you, for yours. Be prepared to give generously as Abraham was. Thank you.
Let us remember that this church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all of our differences, beneath all of our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time, and death and the space between the stars. We pause in silent witness to that unity.
May the blessing of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. May love's presence illuminate your hearts, now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Shalom. Salam. Namaste. Blessed be. And now our service truly begins.